Welcome back to the Melbourne Strength Culture channel. We're excited for the next installment of what we're doing here, which will be myself discussing a little bit more nuanced unpacking of whether or not core training is necessary for lifters. So if you followed us for any number of months or years here at Melbourne Strength Culture, you know that we do like to discuss the core and the application of core-based principles in a lifting environment for mainly the power lifts. However, today's discussion, we're going to actually be unpacking whether or not it actually is necessary for you. We know how it fits within our coaching model and our progressive sort of skill development parameters for lifters and how to use it and how to program it. And if you've been a member or been coached by any one of our coaches, you'll see how we put it within a program. However, today we're going to be unpacking why we do that and when it may actually not be necessary for you to place any emphasis on your core training or the development of core-based strength in the gym floor. So the first thing that we probably need to unpack, because the plan with this video is actually go a little bit deeper, is what is the core and what we define the core as. And for the most part, when we discuss the core musculature, it's anything that is really going to be controlling the relative position of the pelvis and the rib cage, and how those two bony landmarks are going to be communicating with each other through movement, on whether it be on the gym floor or out in the big bowed world, whether you're running, jumping, or doing anything like that, carrying the groceries or anything like that. So for the most part, it's anything that is going to be controlling the two areas of the human body and how they're speaking to each other, whether it be in the sagittal plane of flexion and extension, whether it be in the frontal plane of lateral flexion, or transverse sort of relationships between the rib cage and the pelvis. So when we look at it from that perspective, the core musculature is really everything that attaches to the trunk. Not just is it your main four core muscles of the rectus abdominis, internal and external obliques, and the TVA. Other muscles that may also be involved could be things like the hamstrings, which can posteriorly tilt the pelvis and control a little bit of sagittal competency for the core position, as well as things like adductors, which are going to have influences on the pelvis. And when we think about the upstream muscles, it could also be things like the pecs, the lats, even some of the upper back musculature that can shift the position of the rib cage relative to the pelvis. I'm thinking more things like rhomboids and the retractors, because when we retract the scapulae really hard and aggressively, we actually get an anterior translation of the rib cage, which is really important to understand, and it also fits within the reaching pattern discussion that we'll unpack in a deeper context here on YouTube down the track as well. But understanding how we can manipulate the rib cage relative to the pelvis means that we actually need to understand some of those upper back muscles in a far deeper fashion as well. So when we discuss the core, we're really discussing everything that attaches to the trunk. I know it doesn't really make it any easier for us to then break out the nuance of when and where to apply it, but if we can go into the discussion with that understanding that we're thinking about the rib cage and the pelvis and the relationship that they are in relative to each other and the ground or gravity, then we should be able to at least understand how and why and when to use core training, if at all it is necessary for yourself. So now that we understand what the core is and the key areas that we need to be focusing on, or at least understanding in our application of exercise selection on the gym floor, what does the research say from two main arguments two main sides of the coin that are presented when people discuss core and core training? The first one being that you can just train your core through the main lifts, your squats, your deadlifts, your bench presses, overhead presses, and all of that sort of stuff. And for the most part, that is actually pretty true. Majority of this research is through EMG activity, which there can be some rebuttals against those sort of things when we're talking about activation patterns and why things are being activated the way they are. However, for the most part, EMG activity and multiple studies show that For the most part, your core muscles and the main muscles of the trunk are going to be just as active, if not more active, in heavy barbell training than it will be in things like planks, dead bugs, side planks, and all of those sort of things. And when we think about it, even just from a logical perspective, it kind of makes sense. If you put a whole heap of load on a person, a lot more muscles are going to have to be activated and active in a higher threshold capacity. So they're actually going to be being used more through those movements. So it is no wonder that like something like a deadlift is going to activate the erector spinae and the back muscles of the core, the posterior side of the core, just as much, if not more, than something like a bird dog. It really does make sense. So we know that you can get a good core stimulus from barbell training, maybe sometimes even more so than your typical core-based exercises. The next one is injury prevention and injury reduction. And this is where over the probably the last 10 to 15 years, there has been a big surge of research done into how we can prevent injuries from a team-based perspective in team sports. And a lot of the research is done in those environments, mainly because there's a whole lot more money and there's a whole lot more reason for us to understand keeping Lionel Messi on the soccer pitch rather than keeping somebody on a powerlifting platform from just a marketing and total money and capitalist viewpoint. So a lot of the research has been done on more field-based athletes, but at least we can draw some parallels to what it would mean for strength training in general. For the most part, when we talk about injury prevention or injury reduction being probably a more accurate way, because I don't think we can prevent injuries in any situation. For most of the research and where we're headed from that perspective, core training doesn't really fit in there. Really, the only thing that we can have good influence on from an injury reduction standpoint is an overall training load management and monitoring. Most of the times, injuries can be somewhat predicted or more accurately predicted when we think about monitoring load on both an acute level, thinking more like a mesocycle or a training week, and comparing that to more of a macro level, like a training block or a training cycle. Again, there are some rebuttals for the acute to chronic workload ratio and whether or not we can be accurate in doing that. We're not going to be discussing that in this video here on core training. All that we need to know is that for the most part, core training itself probably won't be preventing any additional injuries. However, core training, and this is where we're going to get into the next part of this video, core training may provide you a skill set that allows you to better distribute load through your body, which in high threshold, high load areas or movements, it could actually mean that we can actually prevent some acute stress on certain areas of the body. So when is core training necessary and why do we have it within our coaching philosophy here at Melbourne Strength Culture? So the biggest thing, and this is something that Charlie has unpacked in detail on our channel, and we will continue to unpack it, is when we discuss strength training, and again, this video is for lifters. So when we discuss strength training, there's really 3 factors to strength training and actually getting stronger over time. Number 1 is muscle mass. We need to get bigger. We need the hardware to actually be able to tolerate higher loads. We need muscle moves weight. Number 2 is the efficiency of your central nervous system and how well it can activate the amount of muscle that we have. It's all good having a large amount of muscle, but if your brain is not well equipped to activate and utilize all of that muscle, the potential for you to be stronger has been limited as a result. So we need to be more jacked, and we need to have a more efficient brain at actually, and central nervous system at actually activating those muscles. The third one is skill development. And skill development in the barbell lifts makes sense. As you get better at squatting, you'll probably be able to perform heavier and more consistent squatting expression, which means you'll get stronger over time. But there's also this idea of skill development of just understanding your body relative to not just the loads that we're using and the implements that we're using, but also to ground, to gravity, to movement, and all of that sort of stuff. So there's this general undertone of skill development that lifters need to understand. And for the most part, we do believe that that is best developed in low threshold environments. And low threshold environments are environments or execution of skills that you can nail 9 times out of 10. And this is where for us, core training comes in a big impact for beginners. If we can put them in a low threshold environment where they can nail their relationship of ribcage and pelvis, and they can express shoulder and hip function or movements, global movements like squat patterns, goblet squatting, hinge patterns, RDLs or one leg RDL variations, push-ups, and maintain their relationship of ribcage and pelvis. If we can put them in an environment or a low threshold environment where they can express those skills highly, that means that we're probably going to get a faster moment of learning for them to apply in a high threshold environment like heavy squatting or high RPE sets, where we're starting to get some stress on the system and things want to break down. If we can execute solid core training in the early stages of somebody's program and get them to understand what different movements feel like around a strong core, it means that we're probably going to get them to accelerate their learning processes in the movements that we want to progress over time, like your squatting, your bench press, and your deadlifts. So if you're new to training, I do believe that core training and spending some time on understanding the rib cage and the pelvis and how they're communicating to each other is a worthwhile endeavor, without a doubt. So the next example that we're going to use of where core training may be necessary for you is if you struggle, and I'm going to use squatting as the example here because this is where it's expressed most of the time. But if you struggle with the management of your center of mass over your base of support, so in a squat performance perspective, it's if you struggle to maintain somewhat of a vertical bar path or somewhat of consistency of anterior and posterior movement, forward and back movement through the squat, what we're probably seeing represented in those sort of breakdowns is we're seeing a mismanagement of your center of mass over your base of support. When we discuss the center of mass of a human standing there in the anatomical position, it's more than likely going to be just anterior of their sacrum or just inside their pelvic bowl, somewhere there. The base of support is obviously your feet flat on the ground. If we're transitioning the body weight forward and the center of mass shifts forward, if we think about putting a heavy load on top of that system moving forward, there's going to have to be some form of reversal of that pattern. And that's where we start to see people shifting forward and backwards, in and out of the hole, and all of that sort of stuff. It's just a mismanagement of center of mass. There's no awareness of where the center of mass and the base of support is. The great thing with core training, and another application for this in a lifter's sort of artillery of exercise selection, is having a progressive manner for you to understand how to manipulate your center of mass in a moving system. This starts with things like planks with reaches, push-ups with reaches, even just dead bugs, where we're teaching the rib cage to posteriorly shift by using some of those anterior core muscles. This posterior shift of the center of mass allows us more room for the center of mass to move both forward and backwards within the system. If we think about somebody with a flared rib cage and anteriorly tilted pelvis, that is their center of mass pushing forward over the base of support. If you've got somebody with an anteriorly driven center of mass, it can really only go one way, and that's either forward and falling over, which the body's not going to do that, or it's going to be somewhat shifting posteriorly. If we can bring it back to a more neutral starting position, it gives the body more awareness and an available range of motion or variability for it to move forward or for it to move backwards, which will probably mean a better expression of more vertical bar path in your squatting. If you want to look a little bit more into that, here's a video here. I'll get Donnie to post a link in the bio for that as well. So if you're somebody with some key technical flaws of just balance control, we do believe core training is going to help you understand your position better and actually execute more consistently on the gym floor in those high environments of squatting and deadlifting. The caveat to all of that then is this idea of skill development for a lifter on the gym floor. And skill, for the most part, is a very quick adaptation. It's quite efficient. It actually it improves very fast, and we actually get better at expressing skills. And anybody that has started core training has probably gone through this. You do a couple weeks and you're really struggling to execute those movements. But within about a month, all of a sudden, nothing's really difficult. And you can even undertake this activity yourself with like an ab wheel rollout. At the start, it is incredibly hard to maintain your rib cage and your pelvis and keep that neutral position through that long movement. However, after a couple of weeks, it really just doesn't, it becomes quite easy. It's no longer difficult because the load hasn't really changed. You didn't get any taller, your lever length didn't get any longer. So really, it doesn't really, it hits a limit of how hard you could progress or how far you can progress that movement. And this is the biggest caveat with core-based training, the typical core-based training, is that it just isn't hard enough to continually drive adaptation. And this is actually probably the biggest mark across sort of the McGill studies of the bird dog, the side plank, and the McGill curl up, is that for a lifter, those things are just incredibly easy. To do a bird dog, I think in the first day, maybe you can take something from that and apply it to lifting, but eventually it just doesn't get, it's just not difficult enough to actually drive further adaptation. And this is where I really like the Jordan Shallow approach, the muscle doc, in that you have to progress those things to actually challenge the system to get better outputs on the gym floor under higher loads. A bird dog isn't going to really be doing anything for somebody that can deadlift 300 kilos. A bodyweight arm and leg raise compared to a heavy deadlift is just nothing. It's like shooting a water pistol at a house fire. We just aren't going to make any difference to that. We need to progress our core training. And that's the biggest caveat to this discussion today, is that if you're somebody that has mastered those low-level core-based drills, potentially you're at the point where core training just isn't necessary for you as a lifter anymore, and that's fine. The great thing is we can use certain exercise selections within the gym floor to challenge some of those key muscles to actually be more involved in the lifts. And these are the things that Charlie's spoken about in depth before, things like Zercher squats and Zercher position split squats and all of those sort of things, anterior loaded exercises, carries and all of those sort of things are gonna challenge those core muscles in a far more progressive manner for the strong lifters out there. Finally, the last piece to this whole discussion, and the last piece to any discussion when we discuss training and interventions or programming or anything, is that if you enjoy core training, just keep fucking doing it. There's nothing I can say, nothing the research will ever say can remove the enjoyment of training. If you enjoy the burn and the feeling and the squeeze of doing ab crunches and planks and stir the pots, by all means, continue to do it. If that means you keep showing up to the gym and keep getting after it in the other movements, fucking do it, because enjoyment is the number one thing. It is the most important thing for longevity in any pursuit. You actually need to enjoy what you're doing. So if you enjoy your core training, please continue to do it, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise, because it is very, very important that you enjoy your training. So that's it for today's video. I do hope that you enjoy these more detailed discussions. We do want YouTube to be a longer format sort of content. We don't want to turn YouTube into Instagram. So we do hope that you're enjoying these longer format discussions. If you made it this far, please let us know. Drop a comment in the comment section or a like, or just simply share it on social media. It can be a little bit difficult sometimes to understand what the viewers are actually enjoying from a content perspective. So we want this channel to sort of be fluid and to move in the direction that you guys want. Ultimately, we're creating this content for you. So if you have anything that you want us to unpack, please let us know. And if you did make it this far, fucking like the video, you dog. Let's go.